In Chassidus, there is a discussion about two types of Ishtalus. A pneumistic Ishtalus and a chitzoniistic Ishtalus. Everybody knows what Ishtalus means. The literal translation of the word Ishtalus, and this is also imprecise, it's the best we can get, is the chain reaction of worlds. The reason I use the words chain reaction, because it indicates the idea of a series of cause and effects. The higher level creates the lower level, the higher world creates the lower world, and so on. There's Atzilus, there's Bria, there's Yetzira, there's Asiya, there's Keser, there's Chochmah, there's Bina, there's Midas, there's Malchus, and so on. And Ishtalus is the gradual steps from a higher level to a lower level. So you have in certain Maamarim where they point out, where the Rabbi point out, that there are two forms of Ishtalus. There's two concepts of Ishtalus. There's an inner concept of Ishtalus and an outer concept of Ishtalus. The difference between the two concepts is this. The inner concept of Ishtalus is that the same light which exists on a higher level comes to a lower level without a diminution. In other words, the same eichos, same quality you have, let's say for example, a madregas chochma comes to bina, and from bina to midas. This is called the pnimius of Ishtalus. And the second concept is that as you go from a higher level to a lower level, from chochma to bina to midas to malchus, there's a diminution. The light changes, and the light changes considerably. So these two ideas, a pnimius de Ishtalus and a chitzonius de Ishtalus. Pnimius de Ishtalus and chitzonius de Ishtalus could also be called alternatively gadlus and katnus. The pnimius Ishtalus would be gadlus, and the chitzonius de Ishtalus would be katnus, or like I said, pnimius and chitzonius. What's the basis? What's the basis for the difference between the pnimius de Ishtalus and the chitzonius de Ishtalus? So let me preface, before I address that question directly, let me talk to you about the word Mathias, a term which is used in Chassidus a lot, and it has a very distinct, a very, very specific definition. And it's helpful and it's important to understand how Chassidus uses the word Mathias. In English, I translate the word Mathias as form. And of course, everybody's welcome to disagree and to have their own opinions, their own interpretations. To me, that word works better than any other word. Mathias means form. For example, a person has an idea about Hashem, idea about the Eibishter, about God. So the point of his idea is the concept about Hashem that he's discussing, and the form of his idea is the way he presents it. Let's say, for example, if a person is discussing the idea of Hashgacha Pratis, that the Eibishter is not just the creator of the world, but he's imminently involved in the creation. So the concept of Hashgacha Pratis, the idea that Hashem oversees everything that happens in the creation, is a thought that is understood intellectually by using various different examples, by using various different forms, by using various different concepts that brings the concept of Hashgacha Pratis to your mind. If you take away the form that carries the idea of Hashgacha Pratis to you, you don't have the idea. In other words, the nekuda, the point is that Hashem is involved in the world directly. The vehicle, the method, the thing which brings that idea to you is the logical concept or the logical argument or series of arguments that allows you to understand it. If you take away the Mathias, it's gone. You don't have the concept unless you understand the form. In other words, there's an intellectual body which is bringing a point to you. That intellectual body which is bringing a point to you is very, very helpful and very, very important. If you take away that intellectual body, if you don't have that intellectual body, the point is lost. Let me give you a physical example. Let me give you a physical example. A very simple, simple example, yeah? You're standing on the side of a road, and a truck, an 18-wheeler truck passes by it, 60 miles an hour, and lifts up your hat and throws it a distance. You have to chase after it, or wants to lift up your hat, and you grab your hat so the wind should not take your hat away. What caused your hat to fly off your head? The truck. The truck goes by and creates a vibration. And as the truck passes you, your hat flies off your head. What's causing your hat to be moved by the fact that the truck passes nearby? So the simplest way for me to illustrate this is by contrast. If you're on the moon or on Mars and a truck drives by 60 miles an hour, what would happen to your hat? And the answer is nothing. You wouldn't even feel any thrust. Nothing would push, would have a leaning, have a tendency, have an energy which is pushing your hat off your head. Why? It's a very, very simple thing, because the truck is not touching your hat. The truck can't move your hat off your head because there's many feet separating the truck from you. But the truck is passing through a medium, it's called air. And air has a certain density. Air takes up a certain amount of space. When the truck moves through the air, it's pushing it away. And when it pushes the air away, it has to go someplace. So it goes to the place nearest to where the truck is. So now you have an increase in air flow from the direction of the truck towards the tip of your hat. And it's the truck is pushing the air out of the way so the truck can pass. The air is being moved, so there's a greater concentration of air near where the truck is, because the air has to be displaced, so it moves, it creates waves, and it hits your hat and it knocks it off your head. If there's no air, like on the moon, the truck passes right by you and your hat's not carried off. So when a truck passes by a person and knocks his hat off his head, that's not what's taking place. The truck passes by the person. The reason the hat moves off that person's head is because there's a way that the truck is touching that person. It's the air, it's the medium. That's called the Mathias. What delivers the energy of the movement of that truck to the person's hat, that lifts the hat off their head, is the air that's being displaced by the truck, which lifts off their head. If you lived on the moon, where there is no atmosphere and there is no air, the truck would never displace your hat. So this form, this air, is bringing the force of the truck to your hat. Without that Mathias, it doesn't exist. The same is true in everything. Ideas bring information to you. Feelings bring value of certain things to you. In each instance, there's a concept called Mathias. There's the Mathias of Chachma, there's the Mathias of Bina, there's the Mathias of Mides, and the Mathias delivers a concept to you. There's a point. The point is that there's an Eibishter, and the Eibishter is Mashgiach B'Hashgacha Pratis, for example. The form, the arguments, the logic, the theories that you use to explain or to prove Hashgacha Pratis brings the point to you. So there's three things here, not two things. There's the person's mind, there is the idea of Hashem being Mashgiach B'Hashgacha Pratis, and there's the Metzias of a Seichel. There's a form of an idea that's carrying the point to you. You take away that Metzias, and the idea never reaches you. This is the concept of a Metzias. So there's a rule about Metzias, which is a quite logical rule. The rule about Metzias is that every Metzias contradicts every other Metzias. One form contradicts another form. Just like in the physical analogy, right? The truck is one form, the wind is another form. They contradict one another. One pushes the other away. The same is true in everything. One form contradicts another form. So let's say you're busy trying to understand the concept of Elokus. And of course, if you're going to understand that concept of Elokus, you're going to have to use words, you're going to have to use form, you're going to have to create a body of thought, a body of logic, which is going to bring that idea to you. That form brings that information to you. But in the process of bringing that information to you, that form is doing a number of limiting things. The first limitation, of course, is that you take away the form, the idea never reaches you. The second limitation is you cannot know the idea better then the form can carry it. In other words, if I am knowing a truth about Hashem, because of my brain, I can only know that truth to the extent that my brain is able to carry that truth to me. The aspect of that truth that my brain cannot carry never reaches me. I've given you this example in classes that I've had with you before. Tools. Tools are very helpful. If you use certain tools, you can cut things with great precision. You can write things with preciseness. Tools are very, very helpful, but every tool is limited. In other words, if you have a blade, a knife, which has a precision and accuracy that can cut things to a preciseness of a 100th of a millimeter, or a 1,000th of a millimeter, or of a 1,000,000th of a millimeter, which is very, very precise. But if you go even smaller, when you go to 10 millionth of a millimeter, or 100 millionth of a millimeter, or of a billionth of a millimeter, the width of that knife is not so precise as to be able to be a precise cut, and there's going to be more on one side and more on the other side. The tool brings you closer to preciseness, but it cannot bring you more close to preciseness than the preciseness of the tool itself. So the Kli, the Mathias, brings a theoretical idea to you. It's in between you and the idea. You have to have this Mathias, you have to have this Gestalt, you have to have this form. This form is very helpful in bringing the information to you, but the form also is limited in its ability to bring that piece of information to you based on the degree to which that form is precise. And then there's another point. The third point is one form is a contradiction to another form, which means, for example, if I am understanding the Eibishter in my mind, but the way I'm understanding Hashem in my mind, to use a Chassidic terminology, it's ba'eirech u'bereichif. I'm understanding it, I know it simply because I think about it and I analyze the length and the breadth and the depth of the concept which brings the idea of the Eibishter to my mind. There's no way I can understand Hashem in my mind and feel Hashem in my heart at the same time. Because the Mathias of my mind and the Mathias of my heart are very different. Just say you can't put two people in the same seat, because every person's Mathias contradicts another person's Mathias. A human being cannot simultaneously be busy with ideas and be busy with feelings, because the idea fills him. The idea preoccupies him. The Mathias of the idea, the form, the design, the structure, the methodology of using your mind makes it impossible for you at the same time to feel feelings in your heart. And therefore, there's a rule that when you have Seder Ishtalus is a series of stops and starts, stops and starts, stops and starts. And if anybody wants to read about this, the place where this is discussed classically is in Hemshech of Shuas, Tafrei Samachei, where the whole point of that Hemshech is this concept that if you will something in your Ratz, you want an idea, you want something. And the want requires you to then understand it. So will has a form, has an energy, has a passion. The form of will does not allow you to be reasonable about that want. So you have to turn off the will to allow the chokhmah to come on. When you use your chokhmah to intuit, to come up with a creative way of understanding what you willed, there's no possibility for you to be a maven, which means analytical and thorough and detailed, and be able to argue and explain that very same thing that you want. It's only when the chokhmah subsides that the bina begins. And the whole of Ishtalus works this way. It's a stop and a start, a stop and a start, a stop and a start, and so on. And the reason this is because Ishtalus on a Chetzenius level involves Mathias. When an idea goes from one level to another level, it takes on the form, it takes on the body of the realm or the level in which it finds itself, which brings it to the next level, but it's very, very limiting. It has to change from what it was before, and it's not able to descend to the next level until you stop engaging in the form on that particular level. That's the only way you can bring it to the next level. This is how Chitzonius Ishtalus works. So if I'm understanding something in my mind, I can't feel it. If I'm very excited about something emotionally, I can't talk about it. When I'm talking about something, I can have a difficulty doing it. This is the nature of Ishtalus. And the reason for this is because on each stage, in each step of the process, as I go from higher to lower, I take on the form of that world. Every Mathias is a contradiction to every other Mathias. But then Chassidus says something very interesting. Why do you need the form altogether? Why is it that if I want to bring the Eibishter, to my brain, the Eibishter, to my person, I need to have the form of Seichel, for example. And the form of Seichel, which allows me to bring to Hashem to my brain, limits me that I can only be using one form at a time as opposed to another form, and so on and so forth. The answer is because I never have Hashem. Since I don't have the Eibishter himself, I just simply have the idea of the Eibishter. You take away the idea, there's no Eibishter. By having the idea, I have a relationship with the Eibishter, but the idea is a necessary medium. It's an in-between. There's the person, there's the truth of Hashem, and then there's the body of intellect which brings Hashem to me. There's the body of emotion which brings Hashem to me. There's the body of thoughts and words and deeds which brings Hashem to me. Take away that middle entity, I have no relationship with the Eibishter because I don't have the Eibishter himself. So Chassidus proposes a very interesting idea, that there's something called the Pnimius of Ishtalus, or the godless of Ishtalus. The Pnimius of Ishtalus and the godless of Ishtalus means, and I don't want to elaborate too much on this, but in short it means that if a person uses his mind to have a relationship with the Eibishter and actually experiences the Leki, actually gets to the Eibishter. In other words, it's not only the concept of Hashem that the person has, but by using his mind to understand the concept, he gets to the Elokee itself. Now, in short, the way this works is because, remember, we all have a neshama. We have a soul, a godly soul. And a neshama is a chelik l'kami mal mamish. It's a part of God. So inside each one of us, there already is the truth of Elokus. The point is only that we don't know it. It's hidden from us. So we use our mind to bring ourselves closer to Hashem. So on a chitzoniistic level, all I have is the concept of God. I never get to godliness. On the chitzoniistic level, all I have is the feeling of God. I never get to godliness. But if a person is a very deep person and is able to learn and understand Hashem in his mind to the extent that he can have what we call in our culture a derher, a sense of the godliness, the laki which is behind the sichli, the godliness which is behind the idea, a very interesting thing occurs. And that is that although the Seichel brought him to the truth of Elokus, because he has a derher in the Elokus itself, so first of all, it becomes very quiet, it was very deep. In other words, he doesn't need a lot of word and a lot of form to bring the Eibishter to himself. He's gotten to the Nekud, he's gotten to the point. What's called in some places Pnimiyas Bina or Nekudas HaTamtzis, the point at the end of an entire deep analytical and intellectual exercise is to have the godliness. So first of all, it becomes very quiet. The form becomes unnecessary. The oirech v'reichev, the words and the arguments, the questions and the answers, the logic, the logical body which brought you closer. So the idea of the Eibishter becomes redundant because the person has a dead head of Elokus itself. So it's a bit of a tricky idea here, because on the one hand you are using your mind to bring the idea closer to yourself, but on the other hand you're transcending the mind by reaching the Elokee itself. Which leads us to another very interesting idea, again also found in Chassidus, and this is called Pnimius HaMeichen V'Amidus, or Godless HaMeichen V'Amidus, that if a person successfully uses his mind to bring himself closer to the Eibishter, and he experiences not only the Sichli, but he experiences also the Elokee, so then the idea that you have to stop and start and stop and start and stop and start as you go through Ishtalus, that when you have an idea in your Ratzon, it can't be in your Chochmah because Ratzon and Chochmah are opposites. When you have an idea in your Chochmah, it can't go into your Bina because Chochmah and Bina are opposites. When you have an idea in your Bina, it can't go into your Midas because Bina and Midas are opposites. It's not true. Because the only reason it's necessary to stop and start, the Ratzon is a stira to Seichel, Seichel is a stira to Bina, Bina is a stira to Midas, is because of the Mathias. In order for me to relate to the Eibishter, I must explain it to myself using these words. And these words are a contradiction to this inspiration, which is a contradiction to this will. But if one is able to strip away the Mathias, the need for a form, to get closer to Elokus, because they have a dead head in the Elokee itself, then it becomes natural. And then, Chassidus says, it falls like dominoes. The Elokus goes from Ratzon to Chochmah to Bina to Midas to Malchus without any, there's no interruptions. It's not stopping and starting. It's automatic. It's very pneumistic. And the Maimorim say that a human being who has the kind of neshama depth, that although he's using his koiches, his mind and his heart to relate to godliness, But if he successfully transcends the form of godliness, means his desire for godliness and his intuition in godliness and his understanding of godliness and his feeling of godliness and his speaking about godliness, and he experiences the godliness itself. So one of the expressions which used in the Maimorim is that Amidas and K'may HaMoichin Mamish. That person's emotions are incredibly deep but unbelievably quiet. You don't see any passion, nothing on the outside. The reason you don't see any passion, you don't see anything on the outside, because the passion is the Mathias. The reason when a person experiences Hashem in his heart, he gets excited, is because if you take away that excitement, God is gone. The excitement is an emotional experience. It's a gestalt, it's a form, it's a fire. You take away the fire, the relationship is gone. But if one successfully brings the elaki, the essence of godliness, into his heart, it becomes quiet, it becomes pneumistic. There's no need for any drama and for any tumult and so on. It's called Moichin Omidus, the godless. It just incidentally, and I didn't look up the story today, but there was a chassid by the name of Rabbi Chaim Lutzki, who was a Tomim B'Tem Chatmimim. And I believe that Rabbi Rashab told him that he's in the madrega of Meichin the godless, which is a madrega, if you're familiar with the Hayem Yem of the Alter Rebbe's Chassidim. The Rebbe Rashab, Rabbi Chaim Yena was an incredible Tomim. He learned in Tzedrin, his mashpia was Reb Shaul Dave Zislin. And the Rebbe Rashab once said to Reb Shaul Dave, I'm getting letters from Bachrim and your yeshiva that are asking questions as they Chasidim from Alter Rebbe. That's Rebbe Shaul, like Chasidim of the Alter Rebbe. So Reb Shaul, this guy, Rabbi Chaim Yena, was a Moed in the Ko'evid. He davened all day long. He was an incredible pnimi, and he also had an incredible mind. He was his understanding of Elokus and Chassidus was extraordinary. And the Rebbe Rashab told him at one point that he has reached this madrega of Midas Amechen, the godless, which means to say that his body, his brain, his heart was so refined that when he used his mind and his heart to relate to godliness, he got the godliness itself. And as a result, like I'm describing to you before, the normal idea that you have to stop and start as you go from one level to the next level, because each level contradicts the other, is no longer. This is an incredibly high level. And the Rebbe Rashab told him he has to basically become a nisted. He has to hide himself. And it's from that point forward that the legend of Chaim Yenu was born, where he would lay in bed all day long, presumably sleeping, and you'd find his pillow saturated with tears because it'd be being hisbandinus and Chassidus. He'd come around and take out of his pocket tickets to the theater that he bought for him and his wife. He was trying to act like as if he'd fallen off the wagon, so to speak, because the Rebbe Rashab told him that he has to hide his madrege upon him, because even at that time it was not lefiyar chador, it wasn't according to the level of his generation. But this is an example of a human being. I, of course, did not know him, but there were people who saw Chaim Yoine. He was an incredibly great chassid, a tamim, a madrege, and so on. Now, so what I tried to present here, and I hope I presented it clearly, although I will admit that it was a bit brief, it was short, it was concise, is two systems of Ishtalus. The difference between the two systems of Ishtalus can be summarized in simple words. In the first system, there's three things. There's the person, there's the pursuit, what the person wants, and there's the vehicle that brings that pursuit to the person. That vehicle is called the Mathias. The Mathias changes. It could be Mathias of Ratzon, it could be Mathias of Chachma, it could be Mathias of Bina, it could be Mathias of Midas. But Mathias means it takes up space. Intellectual space, emotional space, spiritual space. And this is what slows the process of going from a higher level to a lower level down. It creates the need. What's called in Chassidus, there's the Meitzat HaGoren, and there's the Kruma, the Posik, the Banash, stopping and starting. And there's a pnimius dike Ishtalus, where you somehow get around the need to stop and start because you go directly to the Eliki. And here you don't have three things. You have at most two things. The pursuer and the pursuit. Or perhaps you can say it even deeper, when the pursuer and the pursuit become one, there's no need for a medium. As long as the pursuer and the pursuit are two, so you need a medium to bring the two together, a glue, a Mathias. If the pursuer and the pursuit become one, the Mathias is unnecessary. And then you still go through the same process. There's will, there's intuition, which is chokhmah, there's thorough analysis, which is bina, there's passion in the heart, which is midas, and all the steps of the nefesh. But they're happening in such a deep and a quiet way that they fall like dominoes. One brings to the next automatically. So a person who's holding on a pneumistic level, it's not like he's not using his mind. Of course he's using his mind, he's using his heart. But the mind and the heart are so fine-tuned, are so refined to relate to the Elokee that they need no mitzias. They just get the Elokus directly. This is described in Chassidus. One other point is made that separates a pnimis dekei ishtalshelus from a chitzonius dekei ishtalshelus, and that is that this is how I actually started. A chitzonius dekei ishtalshelus changes from level to level. The way Chokhmah knows God is much more than Bina could know God. The way Bina knows Hashem is much, much more than the Midas can know Hashem. Chokhmah intuits Hashem, so Chokhmah is really close to the light. Bina analyzes, and of course analyzes critical thinking and dissecting and taking apart. So the intuitive light is removed, and it's replaced with a thorough and an analytical and a departmentalized exercise of using the mind. But the mind understands godliness through a process. When the heart emotionally responds to what the mind understands, the heart doesn't understand what the mind understands. The heart simply takes what's called in the culture of Chassidus the bechein, the point. The bottom line is what my brain understood tells me this, and the heart feels only the point, and is missing what's called in Chassidus the erech v'rechet. There's a constant diminution from level to level. On the pneumistic level of ishtalshelus, when a person reaches the Elokee and goes beyond the sichli, there's no longer a need for metzias. The idea descends from one level of the nefesh to the second level of the nefesh to the third level of the nefesh to the fourth level of the nefesh with zero change. Exactly what the Ratzon desires is what Chokhmah intuits, what Bina understands, what Midas feels, and so on and so forth. Because since there's no metzias, it's the metzias that limits how much can your brain understand, how much can your heart feel. The limitation associated with metzias isn't, because there is no need for metzias. Okay, so I've just spent 25 minutes introducing an idea. Now, what's the point of all of this? The point of all of this, and I'm going to use an old-fashioned term, is this. The idea of Moichin Amidas the Godless, a Pnimis de Kehishtalshlos, is really, it's a theoretical, for people like you and I, it's a theoretical concept. It's a very, very, it's not just a high level, it's an incredibly deep level. And like I said before, the biggest Chassidim hold Mameichen the Godless. The Alter Rebbe's Chassidim. But if a person is holding by the Madrega of Pnimius, you could make the following statement. A human being who's holding by the Pnimius Hameichen V'Amidas, or the Godless Hameichen V'Amidas, does not need to have Shmira. Such a person does not have to concern himself that his process of learning and understanding and feeling and doing can have an ill effect, can have a negative effect. He doesn't have to guard it against it going astray. On the other hand, if a person is on the level of chitzonius, where when he wills something, the will has a lot of passion. When he intuits something, the intuition has to have light, a metzias of it. When he understands something thoroughly, he has to have a lot of words and a lot of questions and a lot of arguments, a lot of answers. When he feels something, there has to be a lot of passion. In other words, in each stage of the game, there's a certain metzias, there's a certain form. You have to concern yourself with what's called yenikas achitzedim. You have to concern yourself against going astray. For example, you're using your mind to analyze an idea in godliness, and you can cross over from analyzing the idea of godliness to doubting the idea of godliness. God forbid. When we learn Chassidus and we understand godliness, the whole approach is predicated on the assumption that this is an actual fact. We don't doubt it. If a person is busy with doubting, he can begin to approach Chassidus because his mind is someplace else. When a person is too busy with Bina, where he's critically analyzing and thoroughly examining the concept of Elokus that he wishes to understand, because he's so busy with his mind, there could be a Yanika that this person could suddenly ask, how do I know it's true? And on an emotional level, it's the same thing. When you're very passionate about Hashem, and your passions about Hashem are external, there could be all kinds of ill effects. For example, you can start enjoying the passion. We start to enjoy the passion becomes more important than what you're passionate about, and then you can become crazy. Or to use an example which is more typically brought in Chassidus, when you're passionate about God, you're quite intolerant. You have no patience for anybody who isn't emotionally in the same space as you are, and you can be so passionate about the Eibush that you're intolerant of other people. So there's a need for shmira. You have to guard the various steps in the process that bring the godliness from a higher level to a lower level, that it should remain where it's supposed to be. Since a person is holding on a level of Mathias, on a chitzoniistic level. So therefore, it's very, very important that when he's using his mind to understand Hashem, he never forgets that Hashem is not in doubt. When he's using Hashem, his heart, to feel Hashem, he has to get passionate and excited, otherwise there'd be an Amalek dilemma. But he can't allow that to bring him to be judgmental and critical and angry and intolerant of other people. You have to have shmira. This is what we're going to be learning about now. If you're looking at line 43, I always have the habit of writing class 1, class 2. In this particular case, and I may continue this in the future, instead of writing the number of the class, I wrote the substance of the class. Today's class is about Chashmal. Chashmal is a term which is in Tanakh. It's found in the Nevuah of Yecheskel. I know that in modern Hebrew, Chashmal means electricity. I don't know why that word was chosen, but it's a biblical term. And Chashmal has a very profound interpretation, which we're going to be discovering today in Mitzvah Hashem. With Hashem's help, we'll get to the end of this piece, and you'll understand the character of Chashmal. And Chashmal is a shmirah. Chashmal is a levush, it's a garment which guards. Its source is very high, and it descends very low. And if I can use the term that's become the basis for this conversation, I would say Chashmal is a Mathias that represents God, with emphasis on the word Mathias. Chashmal is a fire, is a form, is a gestalt, is an expression of godliness with a body whose role it is to protect and guard. That when one goes from level to level in Ishtalus, on a chitzoniistic level, that the direction, the trajectory of his journey from going from intuition to mind to heart to speech to action should remain on course, that it should serve HaKadosh Baruch Hu and shouldn't end up in places and in ways which are inconsistent to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So there's the first aspect is the reason there needs to be a shmira is because you're dealing with a chitzoniistic ishtalus, and the shomer is a Mathias himself. It's interesting that Rambam in the Mir Nevuchim, in the third chelik, in the beginning of the third chelik, talks about the Merkava of Yecheskel, and it's one of the most masterful works of the Rambam. It's just any person who's learned the Rambam knows how the Rambam works. He has this incredible ability to say things so succinctly, so short, so concise, that it's impossible to misunderstand. And his work on the Merkava is extraordinary in this way, because all the Rambam doesn't explain anything. He doesn't explain a word. He simply says what you should think about. He goes through the psukim and says, think about this and think about this and think about this, simply telling you what deserves attention, what's important to pay attention to. And the reason he does this is because the Rambam doesn't want to give you long-winded discussions on the Merkava, because it'll confuse you by just simply saying, think about this, think about this, think about this. This is not important, this is important. He's giving you a framework, a perspective on the Merkava. It's masterful. The one thing that the Rambam, so to speak, gets excited about and devotes a whole pedic to is Chashmal. Chashmal is mentioned in the Merkava. Chashmal is somewhere on the periphery, it's on the outside. And the Rambam says Chashmal is a very lofty level, it's a high level, it's an important thing. And of course there's Maamar Chassidus, which speak about Chashmal. Here's a Maamar with Alter Rebbe. When, in my yeshiva experiences, that put him, Tov Reish Nun Dalet. There's a Maamar from the Rebbe Rashab, which is very, very long, maybe 20 pages long, that's dedicated to Chashmal, and clearly it's based on the Maamar of the earlier Rabbeim. And this is, of course, from the Alter Rebbe. So Chashmal's idea is that it's a Mathias, it's a form, that's a very high source, and it comes to a very low level, and it acts as a shmir, it acts as a lavush. Now remember, this is the second part of a Maamar that talks about Parshas, the need for curtains, the need for garments. And the argument of this Maamar is that a garment that limits and focuses and gives direction isn't necessarily a bad thing. There's an argument that would say if I can have more and I can have less, why should I have less? And of course the answer is sometimes having more is less because it's overwhelming, and sometimes having less is more because you can manage it and then you can grow from it. So the tzimtzumim, the limitations of godliness as it descends from world to world, are very critical in keeping things in the right place. As you go to the Mokam Hanocha, it should stay in Alakus, it shouldn't go to the Mokam of Klipa V'Sitra Acher. That's what this Maamar is about. And of course, eventually we're going to get to Bris Milah, which is certainly not for tonight. So the first garment, first type of garment that the Alter Rebbe analyzes in explaining to us the need for these garments is Chashmal. Chashmal is not separating a higher level from a lower level. It's not that kind of garment. Chashmal sits around the Ishtalus like a casing. And its role and its function is that because we're dealing with the Ishtalus, which is a Mathias, and in Mathias there can always be a unique Achitzenim. When you go from level to level of Mathias, there's a considerable tzimtzum, and there's considerable possibility for unique Achitzenim. There is a makif called Chashmal, which guards, has a very high source, it descends very low, and it successfully keeps the Ishtalus in the place that it's supposed to be. How? By adding an element of bittul. The source of Chashmal is high, so a little bit it quiets the Ishtalus. In other words, even when a person is experiencing an idea or a feeling on a level of Mathias, whatever Chashmal would be in Avodah quiets a little bit the intensity of his understanding or the passions of his heart, so that it should not go l'makam she'eini rach. It shouldn't go where it's not supposed to go. So anyway, this was the introduction to the class, and now let's learn the class. The Alter Rebbe in last week's class discussed the idea of garment with us, and he gave us 3 examples. On line 31 we had the example of Chashmal. On line 32 we had the example of Kasnes Er, which is not in our Maamar. And in line 34 the example of Minul. Tonight we're learning the first of these, Chashmal. Says the Rebbe on line 44, what's the concept of Chashmal? What is the meaning of a presence of something which is surrounding Seichel Midas? That's basically what it is. That's called Chashmal. Says the Rebbe, the example to help illustrate this is from a person. But everybody knows that it says in Tanakh that if you want to understand, say that Ishtalus Sadar a human being, because we were created in that image. In the words of the Alter Rebbe, Nishtal Shalumehem, the physical person came from the Sfiras HaYenis. So therefore we're a Mashal Mechuvin, we're very precisely like them. So by studying people, you can understand L'mayla. Says the Rebbe, Ki b'midais ein sham mizgalas kol haseichel. When you feel something in your heart, the depth of what you understood is lost. Like I explained to you before, when a person understands an idea on a level of Mathias, now a level of Chitzenius, Pnimis is a whole other story. When they're busy understanding, there's no room for feeling. They have to stop understanding, reduce their understanding to a b'chein, to a point. Based on what I understood, I should feel this, and then they can turn on their heart and feel it. Because if everything that one understands is what's felt in the heart, then the heart would be quiet, the heart's emotions would be like intellect. Those kinds of emotions would have no demonstration, would have no external form, they'd be very quiet and very, very deep. And therefore, Ishtalus works, to use the expression that I use in my introduction, you're going from Mathias to Mathias, from a form to a form, and each form is less than the form before, and each form contradicts the form before. Says the Rebbe became at the same time, Makif aleihem ha'ora mu'etes michitzenius habira. When one transitions from the higher level to the lower level, from the Mathias of Seichel, Mathias of Bina, to the Mathias of Midas, where there's a huge diminution of what the brain understands versus what the heart feels, there is something that is transmitted to what the heart is going to feel, to surround the heart, to protect it from going l'makam she'eini rach, where it's not supposed to go. This is the makif, and this is what Chashmal is, which is bechinas hisbonenus. It's some kind of idea or contemplation, shalamaylam and amidis, that although you're experiencing it in your heart, there is a recollection, there is a trace of what the brain understood. That klipa should not be able to nourish, should nurse from midas, because when a person is emotional, and particularly when the person is passionate, and there's nothing to temper, to diminish, to limit the extent to which he feels it in his heart, feeling godliness in your heart can result in, like I said before, either you start to enjoy the feeling of godliness in your heart and it becomes a selfish pursuit, or because of your feelings for HaKadosh Baruch you become unbelievably intolerant of others, which are both bad things. And you have to temper, you have to diminish the passions. And what diminishes the passions is as a recollection of the idea that came before. Like it says in the Medrash, Lech Lecha from Avraham comes Yishmael. The Chesed of Avraham. I don't know how to say this, but this is what it says in the Medrash. And so Chassidus explains the Chesed of Avraham had a certain level of Mathias. And because the Chesed of Avraham had a chitzoniistic level of Mathias, at the end of the train it made a Yishmael. There's no doubt that by Avraham is also a pnimiistic Chesed. And from the pnimiistic Chesed you have Yidden, and there can be no unique chitzoni, but there's also a chitzoniistic Chesed, which brings about a Yishmael. So when a person is emotionally forward, it's possible that those emotions should go to the wrong place, and you have to quiet them, you have to bittle them a little bit, so they shouldn't go in the wrong place, and this is what Chashmal achieves. And the same is true in the mind. The transition from the mind to the heart is the same thing. When people understand things, intellectuals are very fortunate people, they're very rich lives, but intellectuals sometimes become very ego-centric, they're very busy with themselves. The ego that comes from their understanding actually undermines their ability to be creative and to understand because they get stuck. And that ego is not helpful to the further learning and analyzing and studying. You want to curb it, you want to limit it. And for this you have to have a makif, which is Chashmal. Therefore there is a phenomena called Chashmal, which is makif, which is indirect, which surrounds, that although the person is emotionally impassioned, it shouldn't result in an intolerance for other or pursuit of pleasure. Of course, Klipa has to live, and if Klipa has to live, Kedusha has to feed it. But it doesn't say any place that Kedusha has to give Klipa a 7-course meal. It can give Shaidas v'tzipanayim, hair and nails. Very, very diminished chayas. So when a person is all excited and inspired on some level, Chashmal is meant to quiet. It doesn't change it from Metzias to Bilti Metzias. We're not talking about going from Chitzenius to Pnimius, but it does quiet it a little bit. Upirush inyan ha-Chashmal. The idea of Chashmal is shemalbish lezun, it acts as a garment for Midas and Malchus of Atzilus. Varehu Chitzenius etzlan, it's peripheral, it surrounds them. The source is very high. Chashmal is a makif. It surrounds the midas. It's not the midas themselves. It's hidden from the midas. But because it comes from a higher level, it's able to affect a little bit of a quiescence, a little bit of a bittel in a midah. I mean, you want examples for this. There's so many examples for this. A person learns from a teacher. He gets very, very, very excited. And he runs around screaming and shouting. And then all of a sudden he meets his teacher in the street, or he meets his teacher in his home, or he meets his teacher comes to his home. When he meets his teacher, he becomes very quiet. There's a lot of ways of explaining him going silent after making a lot of tumult. One of them is he's a little bit embarrassed. Who is he to be so passionate about his teacher is teaching? Number two, in the presence of his teacher, he feels clearly the inadequacy of his effort to understand and feel and communicate with his teacher is holding. And the net result is that the emotions are quieted. It's called a bitl. And that's what Chashmal does. Chashmal is a very high source. It extends very low. So its impact on the external mind and heart of a person, and the external mind and heart of Seder Ishtalus, which is very metziistic, and therefore can have unique sachitzeinim, is quieted because of Chashmal. And what's the trick? It has a very high source and descends very low. Very high source means in the mind, and it's even higher than the mind. And descends very low, that it comes down in external things, like words, like something which doesn't have the profundity of the Seichel Umidas. To use a practical example, a halacha l'maaseh. A practical law doesn't have all the richness of an idea, but the practical law protects against idea going off the beaten path. So the practical law is a shmira, knowing the din, the halacha l'maaseh. In the end of the day, protects against the seichel going off the beaten path. So on top of page 56, the Rebbe gives an example for this. Ha'inyan hu kamei hamashal. The example to explain Chashmal is the example of an example. You're learning an idea, and you don't understand it. So you use a physical form. Yeah, I'm going to give you an example, a simple example from Tanya. The Rabbi discusses in Tanya many ideas, and many levels of bittul and avatar Kadosh Baruch Hu. And one of them is a bittul chitzoni, it's called. It's a relatively speaking low level of bittul, where a person is bottled to Hashem based on how he sees the malachim treat the Eibishter. They see how others treat HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and it arouses from in them a bittul to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And he gives you an example. If you walk into a palace courtyard, and you don't know who the king is, but you see that everybody is mishtachah, everybody is deferring to one man, prostrating themselves in front of him, showing him incredible deference and bittul and so on. So when you see other people bowing down to a king, you say, this must be somebody very important. You may not even know it's the king, but the fact that everybody else is treating him with such importance inspires in you also this idea of feeling a great importance for that person, for that individual. So using an example of a king and officers as a mashal, and the nimshal is going to be the Eibishter and the stars and the planets and so on and so forth. The mashal, the illustration of a physical king and physical subjects and a physical person in a physical courtyard is very far away from the Eibishter and the servants of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. The reason you use an example of a physical king is because it's very easy to relate to. The reason you use an example of physical king, it says in some Maamar Chassidishe, is because adds the element of mukhshus, of vividness. When one of the advantages of using a physical example to explain the spiritual things is that it's vivid, it's absolutely clear, because the physical world is vivid. It's a riyachush, it's not a riyasichlis. On the other hand, this mashal, this example, is not at all the nimshal. If you see a king being honored by other people, what do you know about God? What do you know about angels? What do you know about their relationship? It's a very, very different thing. So the mashal is helpful. On the one hand, it brings the idea closer to you, it makes it very, very vivid. On the other hand, the mashal is very far away because it has very little to do with the Eibishter. It's a king, it's a physical king and a physical servant and so forth. So the mashal is helpful, but it's also obstructionist, which is b'chlal how garments work. Garments bring you closer to something, but they also prevent you from getting too very, very close because they have to help you. And in helping you, they're creating a bit of a barrier. So the mashal for understanding Chashmal is a mashal. In many Maamar Chassidus, if you don't know, the mashal for Parsa is a mashal. Here he brings mashal for Chashmal as a mashal. The idea that when a person uses his mind and his heart, and there's a mitziastic form, there could be a unique achitzenim, and the differ needs to have a bittul, and the bittul comes from Chashmal, the way of explaining this is by giving the example of a mashal. So let's read it inside. We're continuing on line 56. Ha'inyan hu, the idea is, kamei ha-mashal. For example, the example of an example. Right? You have in Maamar Chassidus. You want to understand spiritual things, you give illustrations. It says in a few Maamarim that sometimes you'll give a physical illustration. For example, if you want to understand Malchus of Atzilus, you'll give an example from the physical moon. So my Maamar will tell you that a physical moon is a far cry from Malchus Atzilus, and represents it and portrays it very limited, very indirectly, very remotely. But the moon is something you can actually see. It's a vivid reality. And therefore, whatever understanding of Malchus or Atzilus you get from the moon has the advantage of being vivid. And that's one of the reasons people use illustrations. Shulavush la nimshal. It's a garment that's carrying an idea. The mashal, the illustration, the example, which is helping you understand the concept of interest, says the Rebbe, Tziruvei Eisias HaMashal, the source of the letters from which this example or illustration comes, Heim Gashmias Neged HaNimshal Ulevush Lavad LaHaNimshal. The words are representing ideas that are physical, and therefore they're only a garment to what they represent, because the concept which is behind the mashal is spiritual. So any example, any illustration is using worldly things, physical things to explain spiritual things. On the other hand, Sheidish HaMashal Ugavaya Meid Naila. The source from which this example came, that joins together a physical thing and a metaphysical idea, is very, very high, And the proof is, she'ein kol adam yochal le'imem mishal. Not everybody is in a position to give illustrations and examples. You have this taka in Lech Lecha, the very first Maamar, where he speaks about Holach v'Naseya, where the Alter Rebbe says that to bring something lower, you have to have a higher source. Similarly, to use an illustration or an example from a physical thing, to describe something metaphysical, spiritual, and even godly, has come from a very high source. You have to have an incredible amount of intelligence. Ela mishlei shleimid, the examples of Shleim HaMelech, Ubi Gemara Amar al Rab Meir, the Chazal say about Rab Meir, Tlosa Shmaitesa, Tlosa Matli, that the Meir was able to say 3 Mishalim v'Omru, and the Chazal tell us, Mishameis Rab Meir, Batlo Mishlei Mishalim v'Chulu. Rab Meir was so intelligent, not only did he understand things better than everybody else, he was able to find alternative bodies, alternative forms to represent them. So a mashal has 2 components. The source is very high and the manifestation is very low. And that's the basic idea of Chashmal, that it's a shmira for chitzonius. It's a chitzonius around the chitzonius. How do you protect a form of ideas and a form of feelings from going astray? By being higher than them. But what you're using to protect them is more of a Mathias. It comes down in a lower form. V'hainu, the idea is, Kidav kemisha sichlei seichel gaveya, only one who was incredibly intelligent, yochel et samsam sichlei b'moshel, can provide an illustration for an idea. And sheyeh mechuved neged imshal mamish, it should be precise, it should actually be parallel, it should mirror the idea that you want to explain. It's not difficult to give examples, but it's very difficult to give examples that are precise. Masha'in as opposed to mi she'ein seichel gaveya, one whose mind is not on the highest of levels, called kach, daila, it's sufficient for him. But to understand the idea as it is by itself. He doesn't have the ability to create a new presentation of the same idea using an illustration and an example. And if he'll give an example, it will not be precise. Continues the Rebbe and he says, this is an illustration of what the phenomena of Chashmal is. It's a garment, it's a chitzonius around the mind, the heart, and the lower faculties of the person. And in Ishtalus, Za in Malchus of Atzilus, to protect it from a unique chitzonius. When do you have to protect Zun? Only when they're in a chitzonius dika level. And Chashmal is chitzonius even to the chitzonius of Seichel Amidas. And the way Chashmal provides it is Kislapshus HaSeichel B'Moshel. You're taking an idea which is higher than the heart and connecting it to a gestalt of a physical thing which is lower than the heart. The source of Chashmal is coming from the mind. And the mind is used to quiet the heart. In other words, the feelings of the heart, the way the Eibush is experienced in one's emotion is very passionate and very demonstrative and very revealed, is quieted by an idea. But the idea is chitzonius, it surrounds, because the idea has come down in a mashal, in an example of a physical thing, which is even lower than the feelings. And because it has a higher source, but it has a lower mitzias, it acts as a shmira. Like achakach, nasa levush lezun, the idea becomes a garment around Zun, and extends lower than them. Like the example of an example, that's secondary to the idea that one wishes to understand, and it's only a garment. So the basic point is that when you are engaged in something, you need something to protect you from getting lost in what you're passionate about. And the thing that's going to protect you has to be very high, it has to come down very low. So to use, again, an example which I mentioned before, halacha l'maisa, you're learning Torah. And you're so excited about your learning, and you love to learn, and you understand it so well. And you can get so caught up in the learning that there's all kinds of ill things that can happen as a result of that learning. There can be gaiva, there can be learning it incorrectly, there can be that the learning shouldn't bring l'dei maisa, and then there could be the idea that I have to paskin halacha l'maisa. I need to know what to do. Knowing the halacha is a shmira. There's a great story. It's not a maisa. with the Shagasari, Azay Detzel the Welt. It's probably brought in Sfonim. I never saw it, I heard it. That the Shagasari was a Goan Adir. Shagasari was an incredible man. He's a very, very great Goan. And he became a Rav at the age of, I think, 75, and he served till 90. As a very elderly man, he took a position as a Rav. And the Shagasari was a provocative person. So the story goes that the Shagasari once gave a shir on Shabbos HaGadol, Drasha. He went on for hours and hours, bringing raya after raya after raya from Torah, that it's a mitzvah to eat chametz on Pesach. That there's nothing wrong with chametz on Pesach. And the people sat there enchanted. Wow, the great genius, the Shagasari, is bringing proofs from Torah Semes. Anyway, when he finished his whole speech, he said to the people, "No, you're allowed to have chametz Pesach." So they hesitantly and sheepishly said to him, based on what the Rebbe just proposed, it seems like we're able to. He says, well, it says in the Chumash, Shivas Yomim, Tashpisus Erbateich. Finished. The physical words in the Torah say you're not allowed to have chametz. Theory, philosophy, idea, feeling, it's all wonderful. The bottom line is, that's the kind of concept that Chashmal is. It's taking an idea and bringing it down into such a low form that it's simple, and it protects the passion and the process of Metzias that take place in each level of the nefesh, and it's true also in Ishtalus Lamaila, from going away b'derech hakalosim, from going where it's not supposed to go. So the Rebbe now concludes, I'm on line 68, V'hareim kein, as a result of the discussion we just had. Move on, it's understood. Sheyesh bebechinas hachashmal hazeh beis bechinas. Chashmal has two components. On the one hand, Aleph, mitzat shalshei shugaveya meid naila. The source of Chashmal is from a very high level. Like, for example, the shmira against your feelings getting carried away is a thought. The shmira against a concept getting carried away is an intuition. In other words, each level needs a shmira from something higher. But the intuition, which is protecting your bina from going nuts, and the shmira using an idea from your midas going nuts, is you take something which is higher than the metzias that you're trying to protect and bring it into a form which is lower than the metzias you're trying to protect. Those are the two sides of Chashmal. And in the words of the Maamar, it's above the emotional level. If you're trying to protect your emotions from making you angry and judgmental, or from making you self-absorbed, you use an idea, a concept which is higher than the emotions. Based on the other hand, it manifests in a very, very low level, in a form of letters which is lower than the passion. And the example it keeps on giving is from a physical thing. A physical thing becomes representative of the idea. And of course, physical things are lower than feelings. And it protects the feelings to stay, so to speak, in the straight and narrow. The physical example and the words which carry them are lower than the feelings you're trying to protect. So that's the concept of Chashmal. Chashmal basically is chitzonius, that's what it is. Chashmal basically is a makif. In Seder Ishtalus, godliness is being delivered from a higher level to a lower level. And around it there's Chashmal. So first of all, the need for Chashmal is only because the Ishtalus is on a level of Mathias. If the Ishtalus was on a level of Bilti Mathias, Pnimius, there'd be no need for Chashmal altogether. And the Chashmal, it provides a Shmira by being even more chitzonius than the chitzonius of Ishtalus. It starts higher and descends lower. Where do you see it? You see it in the word. And this is what's so fascinating. This is the Reichkeit of Chassidus. Without Pirush Chashmal. The word Chashmal is actually two words. Chosh, which means to be silent, and Mol means to talk. Chashmal. The word Chashmal is a combination of two things. And the Rebbe is going to explain. Chosh means you're so busy being connected to something above you, it quiets you. Mol means you are so superficial that you can't stop talking. Because that's the nature of a chitzonius. One of the things which Chassidus argues, correctly obviously, is that the more deep a person is, the less he talks. And the more verbose, the more wordy, the more people talk, the more superficial they are, the more external they are. Chashmal is a combination of chosh and mol. My soul, my pnimius, comes from a bittul to something above. And my manifestation is mol. You're talking yourself into safety. You're talking yourself into not having a unique zachetenim. Pirush chosh lashon shestika. The word chosh means to be silent. That's the first half of Chashmal, Shaboy, Shushor, Shemiabina, that the beginning of protecting one's emotions, one's feelings, from going astray has to come from ideas. And Syag Lachoch Meshtika, here he brings even higher, right? We're using Bina as a Shmira for Midas. Syag Lachochma means the fence around Chochma Shtika, it's even higher than Chochma. Ki Avaya B'Chochma. The Alter Rebbe doesn't make these distinctions. He says Chochma and Bina are a place where Elokus is manifest, and therefore there's a quiescence, there's a depth. Like Moshe Rabbeinu had difficulty speaking, as the famous vart which I've shared over the years a number of times, where the Tzemach Tzedek was discussing what Moshe Rabbeinu did when the sea was splitting, when the Yam Suf split. We all know, it was in Chassidishe with a big shturim, that when the Yam Suf split, there was a revelation of the highest worlds. All the Yamim split. In other words, the whole of Seder Ishtalus just opened up, and you see kill Atzmos Amuz. So the Tzemach Tzedek said that when this great revelation happened, Moshe Rabbeinu was given kalten brand, hot ice. That means to say, on the inside there was an incredible fire, and on the outside you saw nothing because it was in a state of total isbatlus. The pnimius of Chashmal is that I am going through a process of bringing the Eibishter to me. Behind that process, there's an underlying bittul to the Eibishter, a quiescence, a silence. And I am going to draw from that silence to protect the process of bringing godliness from a higher level to a lower level by being incredibly verbose, being very wordy. And that's the second half of Chashmal. Umol is loshen dibur v'his galus. The flip side, the other side of that coin, is mol, which means to speak and to reveal. Zeh mitzad bechinas habeith shaboy. That's the second side of Chashmal. Kishenas levush lezun, as it becomes a garment for zun. Kumaya esiyat shmal bishim as hanimshal, like words and a illustration, a physical illustration, which are representing a spiritual idea. V'aydei ze yuchaliyas hashba zeh pirush mol. Therefore, is able to come down and come down in a safe way. Just as a slight example for this. In the Gemara, there's a Gemara that tells a story about, I think, Rabbi Amram, one of the Amiroyim, who was tempted to do an Aveda. So when he realized how vulnerable he was, he started screaming fire. And of course, when he screamed fire, people came running. And as soon as people arrived, they realized exactly what was going on. So they said to Rabbi Amram, what's the need of embarrassing yourself like this? And he basically answered, I'd much rather embarrass myself down here than embarrass myself on the other side, over there. The idea is that on the outside, on the lower level, there's a lot of noise, there's a mol, there's a talking a lot, or screaming a lot, or perhaps even something which is embarrassing. And the reason for it is because you want to protect. You don't want chas v'shalom that the process of pursuing godliness should go off the beaten path and end up in something which is not right. And the source from which this chitzonius comes, the source from which a person can scream fire to protect himself from doing an Aveda, on the outside it's so superficial, it's so inappropriate perhaps, but it's coming from the deepest level of bittul. It's coming from a sense of connection to Hashem, a sense of dedication to Hashem, which is deeper than any form. And we're going to stop right here. Okay, we're not finished with Chashmal, but we're finished with Chashmal and Atzilus. We're going to be talking about Malachim in the next piece, and we'll leave this Mitzvah Hashem for the next class.